Are you trying to get into the spooky season but you have no idea where to start? Stick around because I'm going to tell you how to get started in the horror genre. Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. My name is Bree and this is For Pause in a Book. I have gone on quite the journey in my booktube career. I started out as a romance reader. I kind of morphed into fantasy, and over the past year or so I've really started reading a lot more horror books. Once upon a time I said I was not a spooky reader. I didn't want the haunting, I didn't want the gore, I didn't want any of that. And honestly, some of my favorite books over the past couple of years have been in the horror genre, and so I can no longer say that I'm not a horror reader anymore. And today I want to give you some recommendations for books that are in the horror genre, or at least horror adjacent, but they're great for people that read other genres or that are looking for something a little bit less terrifying. Something that you'll still be able to sleep at night after you finish the book. So I have two categories of books here. The first one is going to be kind of a light horror. These are all within the horror genre, but they are definitely the less grotesque, less terrifying ones. There's no slashers in here. There's not a lot of body horror, anything like that. And then the second group of books that I have are horror genre blends, mostly horror fantasy. Obviously, as a predominantly fantasy reader, that's something that I read a lot of, but horror in a genre blend is one of my favorite things, and it's definitely a buzzword for me. So I do have some books that are fantasy that definitely lean horror or lean supernatural in a way to kind of bridge that gap between fantasy and the spooky season. First up, let's talk about let's call it the horror light. I will always promote Darcy Coates on this channel. I love her books. I have given her books, I think almost every book, at least 3.5 stars, with multiples of her books getting 5 stars and being on my favorites of the year. Darcy does such a great job at creating characters that you really love and care about, and that you don't want anything bad to happen to. And also she is great at creating this spooky atmosphere without overtly terrifying you. They are definitely still scary. They are still definitely horror, but it's a really good introduction. And I'm going to talk about two of her books that I think are a great starting point, especially if you don't read a lot of horror. The first one being The Fullcroft Ghost. This is one of her earlier novellas and is actually considered a YA novel. This is about a brother and sister who go to their grandparents after their mother loses custody, and so they go to live with their grandparents for a little while, and everything is just a little bit off, okay? It's a little bit creepy. They're not allowed to have their phones, and at first they just think, oh, it's because, they're quirky and old, but they soon find out that not all is as it seems, and the townspeople are a little bit off. I'm just gonna put it at that. Okay, this has a really cool ending. The plot twist is really unique, and even though this is one of her older books, I think that it was done so well. And then also we have The Whispering Dead. This is actually the first book in a series. There will be 5 in the series. I have not finished the series, but I have read the first 2, and I really like this. And again, it's something that is very character based and very atmosphere based without being, nightmare inducing. This is about a woman who ends up in a small town and she cannot remember anything. She cannot remember who she is. She cannot remember her past. Things are happening to her and she has no idea why. Oh, also she can see the dead. And she ends up at a church and a cemetery that's attached to a church, and she ends up working as the groundskeeper there because she can see the spirits that are there. And she ends up kind of helping them pass on. Most of the time the spirits are still here on Earth because something was not finished, something was not fulfilled in their life, and so she kind of helps with that, be it solve their murder, whatever. As we go along in this series, we do start to find out more about our main character, and so it's definitely a series. You can't read them out of order. However, each story does have a full character and story arc in it. One thing that I think makes horror a little bit more palatable, a little bit easier to digest and understand, especially for someone new to the genre, is to include humor in the story. Grady Hendrix is one of the best authors that does this, and my favorite of his was always going to be Horror Store. This does look like an IKEA catalog. You are correct. It's a very weird kind of shaped book, but even the inside looks like an IKEA catalog. Let me show you. Look at this. It actually looks like an instruction manual. That's because it takes place in essentially an IKEA, and there are some really weird things that are happening in the store, and so the manager asks some of the employees to stay overnight to see what is going on. They obviously don't think that it's anything too crazy, too weird. They just think, you know, it's some vagrants, it's some kids causing some trouble. It is not. It is much more than that. And Grady Hendrix definitely goes above and beyond with his endings. They're a little bit out of left field. They're quite bonkers. But this does have a lot of humor, a lot of like lighthearted jokes and things like that, that just kind of lighten the tension of the book when it is really needed. Another book that I think does humor really well is one that I just recently read and talked about it in a vlog, so I'll link it up above. That's The September House by Carissa Orlando. This is a debut novel, and I think that the pacing was done so well. I hesitate to put this book on a horror for beginners list, and I think a lot of people do put it on this list. I want to say first off, there is gore in here, there is body horror, there is a ghost child with his intestines hanging out. So like, that is there in this book. This is horror. But some of these ghost children are pranksters. We have Francesca, who's the maid of the house, who's also a ghost, and you know, hides things. She puts the tea bags in the medicine cabinet, that kind of stuff. And this also has a really deep, meaningful conversation about domestic abuse, spousal abuse, the struggles that can cause not only on the victim but also the family and everybody surrounding it. So this definitely has a heavy hand to it. It's not super lighthearted, but when it's needed, it has that humor. It has the jokes and things like that. And there were times that I was sitting there listening to the audiobook chuckling. It's a very unique take on a haunted house book, on a gothic story. Gothic books are not generally my cup of tea, but this one really, really worked for me. Okay, the only YA book that I have in this group is going to be You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight by Caitlin Bayron. I do think that YA horror is something that is a really good bridge for people to go into horror, because obviously the target age range is teenagers, young adults. So we can't go too over the top with the gore and things like that. So YA is a great place to kind of dip your toes in, see if you like the genre before really diving into the deep end. This is another one that I recently read and really enjoyed. It takes place at a camp, which, like, summer camp horror is always really fun because it's dark, it's mysterious, it's hidden, it's isolated, and like weird things happen at summer camps. They're always haunted. I don't know what to tell you. Camp horror is kind of a staple of the genre, and this is about a girl who is at this camp where they bring people in to basically be scared. It's kind of like a haunted, like one of those like haunted house type things where you can scare the guest, but they are also acting as like basically playing out the final girl trope. But then people start actually dying, where she becomes the actual final girl, and that's not actually supposed to happen. It's also a very, very quick read, and there is a Pop Sugar Reading Challenge question prompt or whatever this year that is a horror by a BIPOC author, and this would be a great prompt for that if you are completing that challenge. T. Kingfisher is a very hit or miss author for me and for a lot of people in the book community. However, I have found that her horror books are ones that I really like and really kind of get sucked into, and my favorite one is A House with Good Bones. This is another Southern Gothic book. I don't know, there's just some that really work for me, and this is about a woman who comes back to her hometown and things are really different than when she left. Her mother is acting different, her house feels different. You know, gone are the charming walls and wallpaper and pictures and things like that. Everything is very like stark white, and everything is just a little off kilter. This, while also being kind of a haunted house story, the house itself is a sentient character, and you'll actually see that trope come up a little bit later, and I'll talk about that in another book. apparently that is a trope that I like with haunted house books. Throughout this book, our main character has to find out what has her mother so spooked, so frightened that she's jumping at every little noise, and just try to figure out, get to the bottom of what is going on. Another book that is super short, I guess it would be considered as like a longer novella. It's 230 pages, and I read this during a weekend readathon. I can't remember which one, but it was a really, really atmospheric, haunting book. I think a classic staple and a good bridge into kind of our fantasy books, but still calling them horror, are vampire books. This is a really good way to get yourself into horror because vampires are a staple when you think of the classics like Dracula. But we have gone so far beyond the sparkly vampires of Twilight, and there are some very haunting, very terrifying vampire horror books. The first one is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. This one definitely leans more like historical fantasy, but with some horror. And this, speaking of Dracula, is from the point of view of his first wife. And it's an epistolary novel, so it's actually in second person, which you do not see very often. And it is her kind of recounting their life back to him. She is recounting their relationship, their marriage, them falling in love, but showing it as this toxic relationship where she finally meets her breaking point. This is also very queer. It's poly. It's fantastic. It's a short book. The audiobook is fantastic. I've actually read this 2 or 3 times at this point. It's an all-time favorite of mine. And then we have House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. This is also written by a BIPOC author, so if you were looking for that prompt on the Pop Sugar Challenge, this one would also work for it, especially if you're wanting to go more of a fantasy aspect, also pretty historical. This is kind of like a Handmaid's Tale, but make it vampires. Our main character is a blood maid for a family of vampires, basically the blood bank for them. She is promised this life of luxury and wealth and being able to care for her family if she goes and takes this job as a blood maid. She has grown up in the slums and that's all she has ever known. And so this seems really promising, too good to be true, and it just might be. Okay, moving into the more fantasy forward books. The first one is Juniper and Thorn by Ava Reed. I think this is actually like still considered horror. It was on the Goodreads horror list, honestly the same year as House of Hunger. But I would say that this is probably more fantasy forward than House of Hunger for sure. It's a gothic horror retelling of the Juniper Tree, where a young witch is trying to escape the tyrant overlord that is her father, and also try to protect the city from this monster that is wreaking havoc on the city. This was such an atmospheric story. The prose is beautiful, and even though like I don't typically tend to love purple prosy books, this one I think walked that balance so well. I mean, it's not a long book. We use our words very carefully, and you know, it's not over the top, but it paints the picture so well, sets everything up, and it's a perfect way to get into the spooky season if you are predominantly a fantasy reader. Then we have a book that was on the Goodreads Choice Awards for fantasy. However, I think that it's more horror leaning, and that is Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. This one I think is very much for fans of Darcy Coates. This is also very atmospheric, and it's about a woman who is down on her luck and she is trying to protect her brother, so she goes and gets this job at this house, the Starling House, and things are definitely not as they seem. The house is the backdrop, the setting for one of her favorite books, and so there is an allure to it. There is something that is calling to her, and so when she's able to get a job at the house, and she's able to uncover these sinister, dark secrets and find out, you know, what's behind the curtain, a lot more gets uncovered than what she was expecting. This is the other book where the house is kind of a sentient character. The house kind of has a mind of its own, for sure. It's not just a setting, it's also kind of the main character. All right, let's talk fantasy that dips its toe into hell. Literally. The most popular one, I think, of this subgenre, I guess, would be Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, more specifically Hellbent, the sequel. Like it actually takes place in hell, but this is dark academia fantasy, which is definitely my brand of dark academia. I have done a lot of experimenting this year with dark academia, and I've found that the real world aspect of it is not something I necessarily love. However, fantasy? Absolutely. Especially when you get into the dark side of it. This is about a girl, Alex, who, you know, is pretty down on her luck. She has, you know, run a string of dead-end jobs. She was the lone survivor in a horrific accident, and she is finally offered a second chance, a free scholarship to Yale. But there's a catch. She has to spy on some of the more sinister secret societies that are at Yale. These societies have had members that are politicians and athletes, very well-known people in society, and their occult activities are more sinister than what meets the eye. They tamper with forbidden magic, they raise the dead, and they prey on the living. So she has to keep an eye on them, and that's not as easy as it sounds. This is a fantastic, it's not a duology, it's a continuing series, but there's only 2 books out so far, and I don't know when the next book is coming out. But Hellbent, the sequel, even better than this one. Then we have In the Ravenous Dark by A.M. Strickland. I would say that this is definitely like fantasy that has a little bit of horror in it. We are dealing with blood magic and a demon and undead spirits and this very dark, sinister power. This book is poly. It is YA, so there's no smut in it, but there is a poly relationship, and I would say it's definitely on the high end of YA. So we have our main character who is drawn to 2 different people that will be able to help her fight the powers that be. We have Lydia, who is a rebellious princess struggling to find her own destiny, and then we have Avrilios. I could be saying that name wrong. It's what happens when you physically read fantasy books. But we have him, and he is the brooding spirit that our main character is bound to. So that's complicated. We definitely have a few scenes in hell, so that's why I'm kind of putting this in horror, but just know going into it, it's definitely more fantasy than it is horror. But a good bridge. Finally, I want to highlight the SPIFBO 9 winner from last year that I think is mystery, horror, fantasy, all wrapped up in one, and it's definitely on the spoopy side of things. It's probably the least terrifying of any of these selections, definitely more on the spoopy side. That's Murder at Spindle Manor by Morgan Stang. Obviously we do have our like horror adjacent kind of terrifying creatures, our hotel clerk that, you know, has his mouth sewn shut, and this is a gas lamp mystery set in a fantasy world. This is a kind of a closed door mystery. Our guests appear at this hotel. Our main character is a huntress, and she is on the search for a terrifying beast that is wearing the skin of its victims, mimicking them perfectly. 10 guests are residing at the manor tonight, and the creature could be any one of them. Our main character has only tonight to solve the mystery, to find out who the killer is, who the creature is, or none of them are making it out alive. So those are some books that hopefully will get you into the spooky season, even if you are not a prolific horror reader. And, you know, even if you are, maybe I gave you some good suggestions, some recommendations that you haven't heard of, or maybe you are looking to cross the bridge the other way, and this might be a great way to try out fantasy books that still have a very horror adjacent vibe to them. If you have a recommendation to add to this list, drop it in the comments below, and we can use that comment section as a great recommendation thread. And if you're not feeling chatty, do the spider emoji for Murder at Spindle Manor. If you want to take a look at my recent spooky season vlog, where I am talking about the seasonal spooky challenge created by Cassidy, I will have that vlog linked right here. I have 5 horror and thriller books that I read in that vlog, and there were several winners there. That is all I have for you today. If you're new here and you have not yet subscribed, there is a little button that you can do so down below the video. If you'd like to hang out with me more, the links to my Instagram, Goodreads, Twitter, and my Patreon are linked in the description below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!